welcome everyone to the Real Atheology Podcast. I'm your host, Ryan, and today I'm joined by my co-host, but also guest, Ben Watkins. Along with, we have Joe Schmid of Majesty of Reason and philosopher Felipe Leon. And we're going to have a discussion about Ben's recent debate with Catholic apologist Trent Horn, which occurred at the first annual Capturing Christianity conference, which was a couple weeks ago. Now, Felipe, you've been a guest on Real Atheology several times now, but if you wouldn't mind, could you tell our audience just a little bit about yourself and your interests?
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Felipe Leon, and I'm a professor at Philosophy of El Camino College in Torrance, California. My primary research interests are, of course, one of them, of course, is philosophy of religion, but also in epistemology, especially epistemology of modality. That is, how do we know what's possible or necessary and so forth. And that's a little bit of my background.
Love it. And you have a blog, right?
Yeah, exapologist, exapologist.blogspot.com. If you want to visit that, I haven't updated it lately as much as I should, but fall semester's in full swing. But I hope to get back to it shortly. And and then I've done some work in philosophy of religion. I co-authored a book with Joshua Rasmussen on the existence of God, called God the Best Explanation of Things, a dialogue. And then I've written some papers and chapters in philosophy of religion on, for example, cosmological arguments and a priori knowledge, and what's the best explanation of that, sort of theistic or naturalistic view. And then some stuff in modal epistemology.
Oh man, that all just sounds amazing. Like everything you said, I want to just go read it all right now. We'll put some links to those in the description for anybody who's interested in that. And then we have Joe, and we've actually had the pleasure of, a lot of the people of the Real Theology team have had the pleasure of kind of collaborating with you on some various projects, but I believe this is your first time on the podcast. So welcome, and maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and your interests.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm super excited for this. Like you said, I'm Joe. I have a YouTube channel called The Majesty of Reason. I also have a blog by the same name and a book on Amazon by the same name. And I do both popular and scholarly level work in philosophy. So I just kind of covered all the popular side of things. And then also on the scholarly side of things, writing papers and books and whatnot. And so I mainly work in philosophy of religion and metaphysics. And in metaphysics in particular, I work on things like philosophy of time, persistence. What is persistence? What is the metaphysics of persistence? What explains it? Why do things persist in existence? So, and I've also got a book manuscript under review right now that touches on like everything that, not everything, but lots of things that were going on in the debate between Ben and Trent. So, and that is called Existential Inertia and Classical Theistic Proofs. So, it's very, very relevant to this. So,
I'm really excited. Any time frame as to when that might come out, or you said it's under review?
Yeah, it's under review right now, and that process takes a long while, especially for a book. So
yeah,
I can't even give a rough estimate.
All right, so we'll have to just keep our eye out. I'm very impressed by how prolific you are. So I love all the work you're putting out as well, and we'll put some links in the description as well. For people who are interested in that. So thank you for introducing yourselves. So let's get into the review then. And first, I just wanted to express that I really thought that it was a very well done debate and it was productive. I just really liked the posture of both Ben, you, and Trent. Trent's a great guy. And even though I tend to have some issues with apologists, I really appreciate his intelligence and his posture. So kudos to Trent as well. But Ben, you took this high profile debate basically on pretty short notice. So how do you feel like it went, Ben, on such short notice?
So I think that it went really, really well for even having been on short notice. So Trent and I actually exchanged kind of rough outlines of what our opening statements would be, and then kind of settled on these sorts of arguments that we were going to use, because we wanted to give kind of what he called in his debate review clash between arguments, this idea of letting two worldviews really interact with each other, rather instead of trying to avoid blows from the other one or to try to score points on rhetoric, to really just let the arguments interact with each other and let evidential chips fall where they may, so that at the end of the day, it wasn't so much a debate, but more a discussion that people can look onto as a resource for years to come, as a way of thinking about these deep questions of God's existence. And how does something like a robust classical theism square up when we look at evidential chips with something like metaphysical naturalism on the other side? And so I hope that both camps can take something away from the finished product that we were able to put forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, Joe, we were kind of talking about this earlier, but you put out I think it was 3 hours video. And then I saw there was a 54-page document, which I thought was wonderful. Kind of looking at Trent's case, and we'll kind of get into some of that. But before we do, what were just your general thoughts on the debate, on how it went and everything?
Yeah, so I mean, it's going to sound like just repeating you guys, but I mean, it was extremely positive in my lights. I mean, both of the debaters put forth serious intellectual cases. They were extremely respectful. Just a lot of stuff that you look for in debates. So it's definitely so much better than lots of other debates that I've seen on similar topics. And both debaters, importantly, tried to understand the other side, right? So a lot of people might go into a debate about classical theism just being familiar with other versions of theism and not being sufficiently adequately familiar with classical theism in particular. And so Ben kind of did his homework in that regard, which is good. And similarly, Trent did his homework with regard to Ben and Ben's, moral views, ethical views, and so on. So both of them are to be commended on that. And so those are my overall thoughts.
Excellent. And then obviously, Felipe, you're very much involved in philosophy of religion, and kind of what were your thoughts on the debate as a whole? Just what was your feelings about this as a debate?
Yeah, my general thoughts about it are similar to Joe's. I thought it was very respectful and civil, and I think that's extremely important in debate context, especially if you look at sort of the history of the semi-recent history of debates between quote unquote theists and quote unquote naturalists. Because I put quote unquote because there's so many ways you can find those things, but back in the dinosaur ages when I was a kid, like the 80s and 90s, and early 2000s, it was usually this a fire-breathing atheist, and usually William Lane Craig, or somebody, and it was just sort of like a big turnoff to I thought I was going to come here and see very careful a discussion, and often that didn't happen. People just got angry and stuff. And now, you have people like Ben and Trent that are just very civil and cordial, and light indeed occurs upon the scene, and a not less heat. And then generally about the structure of the debate was very, very clear presentation of a sort of a Thomistic, sort of a classical Thomistic defense of theism, of classical theism, and a very nice evidential-based case for naturalism on Ben's side, which I know we'll get into in a minute. But I thought it was very, very well done, and very clearly set out, the big issues to start exploring.
Yeah, excellent. Ben, you kind of talked about this a little bit already, but what would you say the primary purpose of this debate was? Because it's kind of hard to say that a debate, in a lot of cases, obviously they have their place, but I don't know if you could say that a debate is primarily about convincing the other side so much, just because of how limited it is. But what would you say the primary purpose of this debate was?
So I think the primary purpose of the debate was to raise the level of discourse in something like the philosophy of religion. So really to kind of echo what's already been said, these discussions can get very hostile. They can get heated often. And, I've not always acted the way I wish I had in these sorts of conversations, because it's very easy to get frustrated when you feel like you're not being heard, or when you feel like you're being disrespected in certain ways. And so, but those have also been very good opportunities for me to grow. And it's something that I'm very appreciative of as far as the dialectical method goes. So like this is one of the ways in which my primary aim was to give back, in that to show that you can raise the level of discourse, and that you can have these really meaningful and productive conversations between two people that disagree deeply, but both can grow from it.
Yeah. And that echoes what you were just saying, Felipe. Just the nature of the debate is kind of very different now from, I guess, not even that long ago. There were the new atheists were very big and popular, and it was more about sort of dissing the other side, if you will.
Exactly.
Yeah. So good. Well, there was a lot that was put out, a lot of deep stuff that was put out there, and it's really hard, obviously, in a debate like that, where you've got a very, very small window to get that all out there. So you didn't have a lot of time to unpack a lot of it. So that's kind of what we want to do here today. So let's go over some of these issues for further examination. And so we'll just kind of start at the beginning, I'm thinking, and kind of go through some of the points that Trent brought up. And then if we want to talk about kind of your case as well, we can do that. But the first thing that we might talk about is just Trent's case is classical theism. And so he has a very particular view of God. So is there anything, Ben, that you'd want to address about his view of God and versus like your view of God or anything like that?
For sure. So one of the things that I wanted to try to make clear, without taking up too much of my the precious time that you have in a debate, was to distinguish the concepts that were on the table, to distinguish between classical theism and what's often called theistic personalism, but how these are both models of God that fall within the family of views known as perfect being theism. And so I wanted to set out at the outset that I understood that Trent was making some, assumptions about the world and about God that were really important. So assumptions like God being unlimited being itself, rather than being one being among other beings in the world. Like he's pure, substance, form, and goodness. And so Trent worried, I think, about the intuitions that I brought from perfect being theism, thinking that I was, thinking of God too much like an actual person, whereas I should be thinking of it as something analogous to a person. And so, like, I wanted to put on the table at the start that I understood the concept of God that we were using, and some of the implications for something like the doctrine of analogy, and like how certain parts of classical theism don't cohere well together. So those were things that I wanted to emphasize about the model of God, so to speak, that was on the table.
Now, Joe, you obviously do a lot with, you've studied classical theism quite a bit. And I have to admit, I'm not as familiar with classical theism. I mean, I kind of am. My exposure to, and then just to kind of give a little bit of background. So I grew up in a Christian home, and I grew up Protestant. And a lot of my views on God are, I'd say, kind of mixed together. So I've had exposure to some classical theists, as well as kind of what Ben was talking about as far as perfect being theism and some things. So I wouldn't say it's very well organized, my understanding there. But I've always kind of struggled with this idea of God only being understood in these analogous terms. So maybe you can kind of clarify some of these things. Like, so I'll just admit right now, I don't really know what it means to say that God is pure actuality. Like that almost sounds like gobbledygook to me. And I know it's obviously more sophisticated. It's not so easily dismissed, but maybe you can kind of clarify some of these ideas that classical theists have.
Yeah. So the best way that I like to see the conceptual terrain is you have this core, right? So Ben was talking about, you have the core of kind of perfect being theism. And so you have a bunch of Well, depending on how you want to put it, you have a bunch of attributes, or we could say predicates satisfied by the being. But that's the kind of core attributes, the triomnies, so omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, necessarily existent, ase, the source of everything apart from itself, and so on. So that's the kind of core. And then it's when you add on claims to the core that you get divergence among different models of God. So classical theism has kind of 4 core theses that you add to that core of perfect being theism. And then various other views. You can just see that my lights went off. I apologize. I'll turn that back on after I finish this.
No worries.
But yeah, so the 4 theses are firstly, divine simplicity. So that's just saying God is not composed, whether metaphysically or physically, and so on. All of God's attributes are such that they're numerically identical with one another and with God himself. And there's a kind of formula for this: whatever is in God is God. And that's the is of identity. So there's no portion of God that you can distinguish from God himself. So that's divine simplicity. Of course, you can get much more, you could flesh that out more. Secondly, you have timelessness. So there's no succession in God's life. God exists outside of time. He doesn't go from one way to being another way, or knowing one thing and then knowing another, and so on. So yeah, he exists timelessly. He doesn't have any temporal location or extent or duration, and no succession. And then the two next ones are impassibility and mutability. So impassibility just means that God exists in this perfect, pure, undisturbable state of blessedness or bliss or happiness. So God can't suffer. He can't have negative emotional states, and so on. And secondly, God cannot be causally affected or influenced by anything. And then immutability, this is where you get to kind of pure actuality. So that the immutability, so typically under at least Aristotelian understandings of classical theism, where you have that kind of metaphysical backdrop of Aristotelianism, they understand change as the actualization of a potential. So potential is, it's a way of being. So it's not nothingness. It's a kind of being, but it's not full-blown actual being. So right now I'm sitting, but I could be standing. I could be walking. And so my walking is kind of being in potency. It can be, but actually is not. So once we have this distinction between act and potency, to say that God is purely actual is, for the most part, now you can talk more about that, but for the most part, it just means that God has no potential to change. So all of his features are essential to him, and he's indeed identical to them. So God can't change. He can't gain a feature or lose a feature. And moreover, God can't vary across worlds. On God's end. Now, creation, of course, can vary across worlds, but on God's end, he doesn't. He has no potential for cross-world variance, and he also has no potential for change. And so that's the best and most intuitive way to think about pure actuality. It's basically God's immutability, both in terms of succession in the actual world and cross-world variance. So I hope that helps set the stage for the audience, and I hope that makes things more comprehensive. I know you asked about analogy. I guess I could just say analogical predication is where you're predicating something not in the exact same sense, but also not in completely unrelated and distinct senses. So it's like there's a similarity. There's a real similarity between the things that you're predicating. Like if I say that God is good and this cheeseburger is good and that I'm a good person, those aren't completely unrelated, but they also aren't, univocal. They're not in the exact same sense. So analogy is just best thought of, and again, this is a rough and ready sketch, but it's just best thought of as some similarity, but also some difference. So that's the easiest way I can do it. And so I know I'll shut up now.
It's the middle ground between, so there's these ideas in classical theism of saying things univocally and equivocally.
Yeah.
And so the doctrine of analogy is kind of the middle ground between those two different ways of talking about our relationship to the divine.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, good. There's a lot we could go on here. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the ideas is that not only that God is pure actuality, but that he's not just another being in existence. He is being itself. Is that correct?
So it sort of depends on the classical theistic model. So there are different versions of classical theism. Under Thomistic classical theism, yeah, they're going to say he is ipsum esse subsistens, which just means he is the pure act of being itself subsisting. Okay. Now, we can distinguish between esse commune, which is the being that, things in creation all share in common. So like you have being, I have being, lots of different things have being, but God is not identical to that. God is identical to his own act of existence. His own act of existence is identical to his essence, and such that you can't draw any kind of metaphysical complexity there. Mm-hmm. So that's and you have to get into like what an act of existence is and so on. But it is important to note that to say that God is being itself is not to say that like, God is like this thing shared in common among everything that exists. That's not what they're saying. So
good. Okay. Yeah, that's fair. Quick question on, just to kind of elaborate on that. Now, do you think that this view of God is ultimately coherent?
Well, it depends on the articulations. So like I said, there are different, like even within Thomism, you can articulate it slightly differently. And I think different articulations have different problems.
Sure.
I think that there are problems with contingent knowledge, with intention, with abstract objects, and lots of other things. So I don't know if I would go so far as to say incoherent or something like that, but I would say that there are serious problems with it by my lights. So yeah.
Yeah. One of the things we can talk about when we get to some of these things a little bit later, but this just came to my mind. So before I forget, because God is taken as timeless, but he's also sort of responsible for he's a sustaining cause. Is that correct?
Yeah, definitely.
And so I wonder if God is responsible for sustaining, say, an object at each moment of time in existence, how does that not put God into time? So because he's sustaining it at each moment. So at each moment, there's like a succession.
What they're going to want to say is the succession is entirely on the part of the creature and so on.
Okay.
On God's end, you just have this one absolutely simple necessary act. Mm-hmm. And then that act is such that different things are dependent on it and come into being and pass away and so on. And the succession is entirely on the side of those things. And they come into being with a dependence relation on God and persist with the dependence relation on God. So it's not as though God is like performing one act and then on God's end, he's like, oh crap, I got to perform another act to sustain them in being. No, God just has this one act by which he does absolutely everything. So yeah, I mean, you can flesh it out differently. And this is actually one big objection that different thinkers level to classical theism.
Yeah. Now, Felipe, do you have any thoughts on this idea of God? I think you were mentioning earlier that Thomism isn't necessarily something you focused a lot on. Is that correct? Or
Yeah, that's correct. When I got into philosophy in the late 80s, early 90s, in analytic, this is back when I was a Christian theist, there was a lot of focus in philosophy of religion, especially among, for example, the Society of Christian Philosophers. The key focus was on an analysis, a conceptual analysis of the attributes of God, each one individually, and then taking collectively how they fit together. So, for example, Eleanor Stump and Norman Kretzmann, try to say, how can we account for God's timelessness, and how does that fit with change in the world? And how can we use relativity theory, for example, to explain that sort of stuff? And, Jonathan Quanvig and Thomas V. Morris and so forth focused on these attributes. And the trend then was, let's get away from Thomistic theism towards a more philosophically defensible conception of God. And so, analytic philosophers of religion that were, staunch conservative Christians even would just say, no, I don't hold anything close to this sort of Thomistic classical theism. We can tinker with the attributes of God to make sure that they're consistent individually and jointly consistent and so forth to handle certain sorts of issues. And so I came into analytic philosophy of religion when this sort of trend happened. And so that's why I'm sort of out to sea on these Thomistic conceptions of God, which are coming back in. Because of that, I see it more and more. I see Joe's writing a bunch of papers on that, and now a book. And Graham Oppie stepped into it, and so forth. I see that I have to look into that more carefully. But given that, most analytic philosophers of religion still aren't convinced by going back to Thomistic classical theism, I'm not yet motivated. But now, as I said, people like Joe and Graham are taking it looking at it much more carefully, it looks like it's time for me to revisit it. But a couple of things just off the top of my head. This is somebody that hasn't extensively looked into Thomistic philosophy like Joe has. Off the top of my head, just sort of this concern about if God is just pure act, and it looks like it's going to be really hard to avoid the view that time is an illusion. There's this paper written, I think, in late 90s, early 2000s by Gerrit de Wijs. That's just called "If God is Timeless, Time is Tempsless," and he gives sort of little set theoretic proof that, look, if you he did his dissertation on this stuff, and he's like, look, if you accept this timeless view of God, you're stuck with the universe having a tenseless view of time, and the universe is something like a four-dimensional block. Which, hey, I'm totally cool with. I think I kind of still can't believe that there are people that reject that view. Although now I know there's people in philosophy of physics that says, well, I don't know how to fit four-dimensional block kind of view of the universe with special relativity theory. And so, I hear there's problems there, but I mean, to me, that's just sort of the default view. You just got to suck it up and accept it. So I think that's totally fine. That's a totally fine consequence for the Thomist. And by the way, I think that's totally fine for a naturalist to accept as well. So it's sort of like, I think there's no differential support or disconfirmation when it comes to that sort of implication, whether you're a theist or naturalist.
Sure. Excellent. Well, that kind of brings us to, Joe was bringing up a couple of these points already, but that Trent basically is working from an Aristotelian metaphysic. And Ben, you kind of wanted to address this idea that there's sort of a controversial assumption going on in Trent's arguments. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, so when Trent gave his argument from motion, there's two claims that he just kind of made pretty fast, but didn't really give any kind of further justification for.
Yeah.
And they were assumptions like, change is the actualization of a potential. So like he just kind of, says that without giving any sort of defense. And, he assumed things that like anything that is changing has a potential for its existence actualized by something else. And so like I mentioned existential inertia, something that Joe has written quite extensively on, to try to point out, like, hey, there's an Aristotelian metaphysics here that I think our paradigm has shifted away from. But I'm entertaining it and supposing it for tonight to have these interesting discussions, but I want to point out, problems. So one was, this idea of, there needing to be a right now, right here sustaining cause of something's existence. And then I also presented the quantifier shift fallacy, the idea that even if we accept that all per se chains of causation have an unactualized actualizer, it doesn't follow that there's just one unactualized actualizer. And so these were kind of strategic moves on my part too, because it's a debate. Every second is precious. And so, I had to kind of put forward what I thought I could get the most bang for my buck, the most body blows I could get for. And so I thought that these were two really, really powerful objections that I wanted to see how Trent responded to.
Yeah, that's excellent. I think that the argument for motion you mentioned, that was a big one that he wanted to focus on. So, and Joe, I know you addressed this in your response. So do you wanna...
I've actually published, I've published two papers in response to precisely the argument. So the argument that he used is a slightly simplified version of Fezer's Aristotelian proof, presented in chapter 1 of Fezer's 2017 book, 5 Proofs of God's Existence. Yeah. And so I've published in an article in International Journal for Philosophy of Religion on that, and I've also published a Sophia article on that. And then in my book manuscript, I have like 7 or 8 chapters just going through some of the background metaphysics, going through existential inertia, going through all of this, all good goodies, lots of goodies. But what were you going to ask? Sorry.
Well, no, that's all right. well, we kind of got a lot there to go over. So now he made a comment in the debate. So I think here's where I'll ask you the question. We can start there since you're talking about existential inertia. One of his responses to Ben was that existential inertia is not well understood or well studied. And that I can tell is definitely something you disagree with.
Yeah.
So maybe you want to address that.
Yeah. So, this part of the debate was quite frustrating to me, and I think it might be just due to time constraints, right? I mean,
Sure.
You can't really fault Trent. He had like 5 minutes for a second rebuttal or something.
Right.
So you have to go quick.
7. Yeah.
Oh, 7. You have to go. You have to say things without substantiating them, which is one of the drawbacks that I kind of wanted to bring out.
Exactly.
That you have to present a lot of material in a short amount of time, and sometimes that's not most conducive to fruitful dialogue. So that's one of my downsides. But going back to your question, so I do think it's mistaken to say that it's not well studied. I mean, there have been, probably close to, I don't know. Well, it depends on what you mean by well studied, but there have been a number of several different papers published on it from several different perspectives. I have this huge, like 60,000 word blog post, So You Think You Understand Existential Inertia, where I go through like all the extant objections to it in the literature, and I develop different metaphysical accounts of it. It's just, to say that it's not well studied is firstly just, it doesn't even address Ben's point, right? So what? But secondly, I think it's just false. There's tons of stuff on it and lots of stuff forthcoming as well. So,
Right. I saw your document on that. Yeah, go ahead.
By the way, I wanted to put in a plug for Joe's papers on this stuff. They're really carefully argued and very clear, and so I recommend those papers.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Are they, where can we find them?
So I have the Phil papers. You can search, or a Phil People profile. Basically, just search up Phil People Joseph C. Schmid. You'll find it.
Okay. Good.
And I mean, it's not fully updated because I've had like 2 or 3 papers accepted since, or like that are still like in production right now. So those should be coming out sometime soon as well. And that'll update on the Phil papers.
Okay, yeah, we'll have to put a link to that as well in the description. So that sounds great. Now, Felipe, you work in the sort of philosophy of science as well. Is that correct?
I don't have any publications in philosophy of science, but I am sort of hopefully developing as a researcher in philosophy of science, especially philosophy of physics.
Right.
But sort of a work in progress. But I don't have any publications in that area.
Okay, yeah. Do you have any thoughts on this existential inertia idea, just the idea of the persistence and from like a more of a physics perspective?
No, to the extent that I think there's a really strong burden of proof on anybody that's going to deny the conservation laws. To that extent, I think that there's existential inertia in the sense that people sort of any kind of quantity that you could think of related to the dynamical properties of a physical system are going to be conserved. And it seems presupposed in that quantities of matter are going to be preserved. And so I guess I don't yet see any kind of pressure coming from a theistic perspective of why, for example, some kind of ground of existential of moment by moment existence, sustaining an existence, requires any sort of external cause. External in the sense that, in the very broad sense, that's hostile to or incompatible with any kind of naturalism.
Yeah, sorry to jump in, but I just wanted to say something on that. I've actually talked with many different theists, including classical theists, including professors of mine, like Jeff Brower, for instance. Many who are interested in the doctrine of divine simplicity and who've researched that will certainly be aware of Jeff Brower's work. But I've talked to a lot of these people, and a lot of them just find these kinds of what I call persistence arguments, where this kind of requirement for an extrinsic or external continuous sustaining cause, they don't find those plausible. They think, of course things would be inertially persistent under, say, a naturalistic worldview, and even they kind of take it as a default. And they think the reason they go for divine sustenance is because they have other reasons for being theists, and they already have God in their ontology. And so then they put God to work, as it were, right? They put God to work and doing some explanatory heavy lifting with respect to persistence and so on. And also, God is a perfect being, and so everything else would depend on him and so on. This is not to say all theists are like that, but I've talked with a number of them, and they kind of express the same sentiment that Felipe is saying. They're like, well, of course things would like inertially persist. The only reason I don't accept that is because I already have God in my ontology. So
interesting. Joe, would you say that existential inertia is probably the best response to like the argument from motion and change? Do you think that pretty much defeats that argument?
Well, I think there are lots of different responses that one could take, and really, I think it might just depend on one's metaphysical inclinations, to be honest. So some people might be more inclined to raise the existential inertia objection and find it plausible, but I think it'll vary by person. I mean, another really strong objection that Ben was gesturing towards earlier is that there is just so much metaphysical backdrop presupposed by this. The act potency analysis of change, for instance, requires what's called pluralism about being. And pluralism about being, or ontological pluralism, says that things exist in different ways, or at least there are different ways of being. We're not just talking about different properties. We're talking about different ways of being, different kinds of existence. And that is an extremely unpopular view in contemporary metaphysics and so on. Most contemporary metaphysicians are ontological monists. There's only one way of existence, a single concept of existence that applies to everything. And so I actually had Trent and Merrick's on my channel to discuss, for instance, one of his arguments against ontological pluralism. But my point is just that there's so much hidden beneath the surface here, so much metaphysical baggage going on that, I don't know, it's just kind of run roughshod over in these kinds of popular presentations. Like, people don't realize that this massive debate is just being like steamrolled over in this presentation in like 5 seconds by someone saying, change is the actualization potential. Now let's move on to the next premise. It's like,
yeah.
And I would certainly want to say that there's also so one of the things I wanted to press in this debate as a strategic move too was the gap problem. Like, we could accept the argument for motion in its entirety, and we still wouldn't have said anything about the moral properties of this being unless Trent put something like the privation view of evil on the table. But I know we'll get there. I had objections. I tried to put as much pressure on that view as I could.
Yeah, absolutely. So before we move on from this one, then just real quick, Joe, I'm curious, what would you say is the best challenge to the argument from motion? So you said there was different ways people could approach it depending on their sort of their views, but do you have a particular way of addressing it that you feel is the strongest?
Yeah, so I mean, if I were in a debate, I would go after two things. The analysis of change is the actualization of potential. I'd go after that. And then I'd present existential inertia, and I'd go through the different metaphysical accounts, because I think that there are viable inertialist friendly, that is to say, inertialist friendly explanations of persistence. So explanations of persistence, not rendering persistence brute or inexplicable, but you can explain it in terms that are compatible with existential inertia. So I would level those two objections. I think those are probably the most forceful, just going after the metaphysical backdrop, firstly, and then secondly, existential inertia. But there are lots of other important ones. Actually, okay, a third one, sorry, I'm cheating. But,
go for it.
But I think that there is just a huge leap between unactualized actualizer and purely actual actualizer. I don't think the argument at all gets you to purely actual, no potentials whatsoever. Instead, it only gets you, if you grant all the other stuff, to something that is in fact unactualized in respect of its existence. That could, for instance, be the neoclassical theistic God, which has potentials for cross-world variance or perhaps potentials over time, but it's still a necessary being. It's unactualized and it actualizes everything else. So I think that those are the three biggest problems by my lights.
Yeah, and that last one you actually addressed fairly extensively in your review and the document you put out. So absolutely, yeah. What do you think of the before we move on from the argument from change then? So we addressed the existential inertia. I know Trent in his response video came back a little bit to the quantifier shift fallacy. What are your thoughts on that? So I guess since we'll go with you, Joe, again, and then Felipe, maybe get your thoughts as well. on that.
Yeah. So whether this fallacy is committed, I think depends on the formulation of the argument. So, I mean, if you can give an independent argument for number one, the unactualized actualizer has to be purely actual. And number two, there can only in principle be one purely actual thing. Then yes, you will have solved the quantifier shift problem. So that, I mean, yeah, I mean, we can get into those kinds of arguments if we want. I don't think they succeed, either of those. But if you don't establish either of those, then it doesn't seem to me that you'll be able to circumvent the problem. And because, again, the argument is only saying that each per se chain of changes or actualizations is finite. And of course, from that, you only get that each one has a first member. You simply can't get from that there is some one first member such that all the different per se chains in reality trace back to it. So you don't have an unactualized actualizer of everything else. You could have a panoply of mundane unactualized actualizers.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he attempted to explain or try to prove that there could only be one. Is that in the debate? Yeah. What do you think of that argument he gave?
I disagree with it very strongly. So there are a number of different reasons that he gave, but one reason is that if there were two purely actual beings, one would have to have a feature that the other lacked, right? If they're distinct, well then how could they be distinct if one of them didn't have a feature that the other lacked? So it's a kind of like identity of indiscernibles thing. Yeah. Now, for starters, lots of philosophers reject the identity of indiscernible, it is the identity of indiscernibles. Right. So lots of philosophers would just reject that principle. It's highly controversial. But setting that aside, even if we granted that, the mere fact that one being has a feature that the other one lacks doesn't entail that the other one is even potentially having that feature. I lack the feature of being made entirely of platinum, but I'm not even potentially made entirely of platinum. Right. So potency doesn't follow upon lacking. Sure. And so that's one problem. Another problem is Trinitarianism. So that kind of identity of indiscernibles argument, it's perfectly general in scope. It applies to any X and Y that you want to focus on. So long as X and Y are distinct, you would need to have some kind of individuating feature that one has that the other lacks. And if that entails potency, well, then there's going to have to be potency between when you substitute X and Y for the Father and the Holy Spirit, say, in which case there's going to be potency in God. So, and again, for the audience who want to look into that further, I just advise checking out my sort of debate review, but also just my response to Trent's case. Yeah.
Right. Felipe, any thoughts on the quantifier shift fallacy?
Not anything other than what's been said in sort of the secondary literature from decades ago, including people like Galvin Flanagan and stuff. Criticisms, I think, in God, Freedom, and Evil about that. But so my knowledge is pretty rudimentary about that sort of thing. So I'm not the best guy, but just some general points. So, for example, this idea of the God of theism being the unique candidate for, say, suppose you grant, for the sake of argument, right, arguendo, that there must be some ground of being. I mean, it's not the only game in town. Thomism isn't the only game in town. You could be a Spinozist, right? Spinoza's thought that God's being and essence are identical. He thought, and so he gave an ontological argument, but his God seems to have more being than the Thomistic God. He has extension, right? And the Thomistic God is unextended. And so he seems to have more being and more attributes than the God of Thomism seems to be metaphysically truncated because it has no extension, whereas the Spinozistic God has both extended and unextended attributes as its essence, and it accesses every possibility. And so its creation its creation seems to be much more extensive and, in fact, maximal, which seems to be, if you're in the market, if you're in the ontological market for a metaphysical package that explains, that sort of has this kind of maximality, that the most real being that has pure actuality, I think a better option in the market is some sort of Spinozistic view.
If I can, sorry, go on.
Oh, but just this deeper point, just a very general point is, I got the impression that, and by the way, Trent Horn did a very good job expressing his view, and I hardly know anything about Thomism. But I just wanted to say, like, it seemed like there was an assumption that a naturalist can't take any layer of concrete reality to be necessary. And I would just like to challenge that. Like, what is it about naturalism that says, say the metaphysical ground floor of concrete reality is a necessary being? That seems to be, I mean, I'm close to that view. I think that's a pretty cool, intellectually satisfying view. Well, the universe has to exist.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's all I wanted to say.
I wanted to piggyback off of what you were just saying there, where, Thomism, you were saying, is not the only game in town. Even if we grant all of this stuff about, even if there is a purely actual ground of being, I think that there are naturalist friendly proposals that are entirely compatible with that. So I know, Felipe, for instance, that you are familiar with Alyssa Ney, Jill North, their work in atemporal wave function monism and so on. I have/am co-authoring /co-authored a paper with our friend, I'm not sure if I don't have permission to share the name, but one of my philosopher physics friends, and we're talking about the relationship between existential inertia and wave function monism. And it's really interesting, but under like some wave function monist views, the foundation of concrete reality is a timeless, non-spatiotemporal, sui generis, universal wave function. This thing, if we take it to be necessary, and if it's timeless, it's going to be purely actual, essentially. It's not going to have, we can suppose that all of its features are essential to it and so on, so it doesn't even have potency for cross-world variance. And so in that case, we have a purely actual, naturalistically acceptable being, have this timeless, non-spatiotemporal wave function that functionally realizes time and all the other things in space-time and so on. And so there are even naturalist-friendly proposals, I would argue, of a ground of being that is purely actual. Now, of course, we can get into the question of whether or not its essence is identical to existence. But again, here we're just talking about the argument from motion. We're just asking whether or not it has potency, okay? So even if its essence is distinct from its existence, right now we're just focusing on whether it has potency. So yeah, I just wanted to piggyback off of what you said there, Felipe.
Yeah, excellent points. I think we're like-minded here. I think a big plug for Listene's recent book, The World in the Wave Function. Nice. Excellent exposition and defense of the view that sort of the most fundamental concrete thing that exists is the universal wave function of quantum mechanics. Yeah. And all other phenomena sort of emerge from that. Yeah. And it's just this, every possible state of the universe, past, present, and future, is actual in this universal wave function. And it's purely actual. Right. And it's interesting. It's a fascinating view. I put this in a footnote in my book with Josh, but I said, I'm inclined to this sorts of view, and it's hard. It doesn't really fit in a sort of classically naturalist view, right? So at the end of her book, Listening is like, well, you could take this as a form of either idealism or monism, right? A very Eastern, sort of something akin to something in the Eastern religions is sort of, right. Individuals are sort of kind of like Spinozistic modes. Right? And so, what is this thing? It doesn't exist in physical space. It's in configuration space, which cannot be reduced to physical space and time of the 3 dimensions plus time that we're used to.
Joe Schmid. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, so it's a very different thing entirely. It's than what we're used to in terms of, sort of Newtonian atoms in, physical space as a container or something like that. It's a radically different view, but it's completely naturalism friendly. And so, I think that's an excellent example, Joe.
Joe Schmid just had an excellent episode with Dr. Eric Steinhardt on what he calls an atheistic Platonism. And so he kind of refers to, this idea of the one. And you could definitely feel the, Eastern influences on that view. He even mentioned specifically Buddhism. And so I'm seeing how there's a lot of these monist views that kind of seem to be my favorite metaphor from Parfit, climbing, the same mountain from a different side. They all just kind of keep converging on this ontological monism.
Mm-hmm. Have either of you read or heard of at least a book called The Nature of Contingency?
Yeah, it's a great book by Alistair Wilson.
Yes. So this is because we were talking about David Lewis earlier. I'll admit I'm very drawn to the idea of modal realism, but when I read this book, The Nature of Contingency, so it's about quantum physics as modal realism, something just really clicked there for me. I'm not saying I full on believe it, because obviously there's a lot to unpack and ways that it needs to be supported, but I really feel myself drawn to that as a very real possibility, and as you kind of mentioned, Felipe, a very satisfying view. So I just wanted to bring that up. So
and I mean, if in quantum mechanics, Everettian quantum mechanics seems to be the simplest theory with the widest scope.
Right.
It's very natural. There's no extra bells and whistles that you'd have to accept with, say, Bohmian mechanics or GRW or something.
Exactly.
Other interpretations of quantum mechanics. You just
backwards causation.
Yeah, exactly. So you just get, all you have is just the wave function, and it decoheres and branches, and all the other branches, the decohering branches of reality are different parallel universes, which is very nice. I think, he calls, Alistair Wilson calls it Everettian modal realism, right? And so for something to be a possible world is just for have it to occur in one branch of the wave function, at least. If it's necessary, it occurs in every branch. I mean, that brings up difficult issues about Blackbird's dilemma, about advanced modalizing. Like, is the set of worlds, is it self-necessary or contingent? But that's true of every account of possible worlds, so it's a problem for nobody, I think. Right. But I find it satisfying. I'm with you by saying, the more time goes by, the more it makes sense to me and is more intuitive to that sort of a plenum of reality. It just seems way more intuitive and natural than saying there's a single universe. But if so, then issues about take all that spelling out, but issues about contingency and fine-tuning and stuff seem to be very undermotivated once you accept that sort of a picture.
Absolutely. Great. Well, let's go to the next item then, which I think is one of my favorites, because I'm a mathematician. And so when he brought up causal finitism, and then of course got into Hilbert's Hotel, I was like, okay, this is like something that's
look how excited Joe is right now.
Yes. This is also I'm very excited about this.
So I was very motivated to look at this from a mathematical perspective, just because that's my forte. But I kind of combined it. I called it the. Let's make sure I'm saying this right. Is it Bernadete? Is that how you say it?
Close. Bernadete.
Okay, thank you. Bernadete, Hilbert Hotel. I really appreciated that he combined those two things together. I thought that was very nice of him.
I applaud Trent for that. Yes.
Yeah, I thought that was super creative, because I was like, wow. I didn't think about combining these two thought experiments, but it does fit into a nice little story. That was like super creative.
Yes. Yeah, I absolutely like that. So I've always been a big fan of Hilbert's Hotel. I think infinity is extremely interesting from a mathematical perspective and a philosophical perspective. Now, I'm not inclined to think that I'm not necessarily opposed to the past being finite, but I'm not inclined to think that it's not possible. But I'd like to get your guys' thoughts. So Joe, maybe we'll start with, actually, Ben, did you have anything you wanted to say about that you didn't get to say, first of all, regarding that?
Well, I'll just say that, so like I, made something of a strategic move in not trying to unpack too much the nature of infinity and Cantorian set theory in my 7-minute rebuttal. Because one, I just think it'd be very, very difficult for me. I don't think the audience would have very much appreciated it. It was already technical enough.
Sure.
And so I just granted it.
Yeah.
Conceded it, supposed that the universe was finite, and then asked the question, can we get to the God of classical theism from there? And so I just said that no, that we can't, like, even if we assume that the past is finite, we're still not going to get to, perfect being theism, much less classical theism.
Right. Yeah.
And so that was and so I used various ways of trying to cast doubt on the idea that there has to be this personal cause of the universe. I mentioned the argument from physical minds. I mentioned the gap problem. I mentioned how if you're committed to something like a doctrine of creation ex nihilo, God is going to change in relation to creation at the act of creation. And so that God wouldn't be timeless or immutable. And so, I mean, these are, objections that, people like William Lane Craig and Swinburne and Plantinga, pose for this idea of classical theism. And so, that's why God, someone like Craig says that, God enters time at the moment of creation. Like he's timeless before the act of creation, but at the moment of creation, he comes in time. They're trying to solve that problem. And so I just wanted to throw these other problems out there and also to help reinforce, I gave an argument from simplicity saying that, naturalism was simpler because classical theism has a coherence problem. The pieces don't seem to fit together well a priori. And this is kind of one of the ways that they don't really fit well together.
Right. Excellent. So Joe, I know you were kind of chomping at the bit there. So you addressed this in your document, but I want to give you a chance to kind of go over this, especially since I can tell you're very excited, which I am as well. So yeah, what are your thoughts on his Hilbert Hotel style argument here?
So yeah, I will have to restrain myself because I don't want this to go for 8 hours, but I could. That's a threat. But yeah, so let's see. Let me start with Hilbert's Hotel. One thing to say at the start is just, this kind of points to the person-based nature of justification. I think whether or not someone is justified in something is a function of a whole host of factors that are individual specific, like their priors, the intuitions that they have, the books that they've read and the articles that they've read, and even the particular order and their body of testimonial evidence and so on. But for me, the argument from Hilbert's Hotel is just, it's kind of dead on arrival because I don't share any of the intuitions. I don't think it's absurd. I don't even find it counterintuitive. Maybe that's because I was brainwashed into Cantorian set theory from the beginning, but I don't know. I don't find it unintuitive. I think it's, of course, if you have an infinitely capacious hotel, of course you could subtract infinitely many and have 3 left over. If you subtract in a different way, of course you could have all the even numbers left over if you subtract out all the odd numbers. I don't find it at all unintuitive. And so I don't find it absurd or anything. Right. That's a confession. So
sure.
The argument is just
I'm with you.
It's just dead on arrival for me. So, but even setting that aside, I think that there are other problems. So I'll just articulate one, and then I'll be done for Hilbert's Hotel. So the first, it's just a problem with symmetrical future Hilbert's Hotel. So like Christianity, for instance, requires
I liked this argument, by the way.
Yeah, Christianity requires that there's an endless afterlife. So you might be in hell, you might be in heaven, you might be in purgatory, although that's kind of temporary. But anyway, there's an endless afterlife. You go on and on and on and on and on, such that each day has a successor day. And, speaking lightly with days, we just need some kind of metrication of time. And so, yeah, Christianity implies that there's an endless afterlife. But if that's the case, well, then you get all the same quote unquote absurd subtractions that you do with a beginningless past, or even just a regular Hilbert's Hotel that exists in the present, right? We could have 2 angels, which alternate their praises to God on each day of the endless future. So that's kind of like how many praises are such that they will be sung? Infinitely many. Now we can ask
on the head of a needle.
Yeah, exactly, on the head of a needle. Yeah, but now we can ask. Let's just suppose that we move to a different world where one of the angels decided not to do it. So all the even numbered days are such that they have praises, and all the odd numbered days are such that they don't have praises. Now we can ask, how many praises are such that they will be sung? Infinitely many, despite the fact that we subtracted infinitely many going across these worlds. But now suppose in a still further world that not only did the first angel, withdraw, but the second angel's also like, you know what, screw this, I'll do this for a week and then I'll be done. So he's just going to chill for the rest of eternity. So this angel then would just be doing seven. We can ask how many of praise events are such that they will occur. That answer is 7. The number is 7. And so we just subtracted infinitely many again, but we got a finite number. So like infinity minus infinity is infinite. Infinity minus infinity is finite. Oh, spooky. It's absurd, which means we get an impossibility, which means the future cannot be endless, because if it were endless, all these sorts of different praises would be possible. But per the Hilbert Hotel line of thinking, they aren't possible. And hence the future cannot be endless. And hence Christianity, because it implies that the future is in fact endless and hence can be endless, it follows that Christianity is false. And so, yeah, there are, anyway, sorry, I'm off my high horse now and I'll turn it over to you guys.
No, I share your, I share that feeling with you, that I don't find it at all problematic, especially coming from a mathematical perspective. At all. Where I think his argument was more forceful, so on just the Hilbert's Hotel side, I totally agree. I think it's not something that any naturalist or anybody should be really worried about. But where I thought it was more forceful was when he brought in the paper passing part. What are your
That's
thoughts?
from Kuhn's, right? Robert Kuhn's gives the paper passing.
Yeah. I mean, it's just
a style of argument.
It's a stylistic, yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's a stylistic variant of the Bernadete paradoxes that go back to Bernadete. And exactly. Like Alex Malpass says, you might be able to find something like this in a pre-Socratic or something.
Right. Yes. So what are your thoughts on that? Because I could see someone, listening to you saying, yeah, I mean, infinity, I could see would not, the arithmetic of infinity would not be the same as with finite numbers. So I have no problem with that. But I am having a trouble thinking about this paper passing example, or, Bernadete style argument. Yeah. How do we make sense of that, Joe?
Yeah. So I'll be brief and then I'll turn it over to Felipe, because I'm sure he also has some thoughts.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So there are two objections that I'll raise here. The first one is similarly with the endless future. Okay. So like, maybe we could just grant Trent this stuff about, the past can't be beginningless. Well, if your argument shows that, your Bernadete paradox shows that, well, then there's going to be an equally powerful Bernadete paradox that we can just stretch into the endless future direction. And the way that goes is, so the original paradox is we have a beginningless series of infinitely many paper passers, and each of those paper passers follows a rule, right? This rule is write your number on the paper. So they're all given unique natural numbers. Write your number on the paper if and only if no earlier reaper writes their number. Right. Once you get that specification, boom, you automatically get a contradiction. And that's the past-oriented version. But you can equally construct a future-oriented version so long as you sprinkle in a little bit of divine omniscience. Right. So all you need is, if the future is endless, or if the future could be endless, well then, on each day of the future, God could create an angel. Okay, so on each day of the future, God could create an angel. Or I guess I should have that modal operator out in front. It could be the case that on each day of the future, God creates an angel. Right. So just one angel each day, okay? And so then if that's the case, well then each of those could be given a unique natural number upon their creation. And they could also be given a paper and a pencil, okay? And let's suppose that each of them follows the following rule. Write your number on the paper if and only if no later angel writes their number on the paper. And you get the exact same contradiction there. Mm-hmm. And now the question arises, well, hold on a second. How can these angels know the future, right? Because they're like writing the number based on what the future reapers do, or the future paper passers do. Yep. That's where divine omniscience comes in, right? If you have an infallibly omniscient being that knows the future, which is true on Trent's case, well, then God can simply reveal to each individual angel just whether or not. It's only one proposition that God's revealing to these things, and God can obviously reveal things to people. So. Yeah. All God needs to do is reveal to each angel, once that angel is created and it's given its little paper and pencil and its number, all God needs to do is just reveal to them that one statement, whether or not any future reaper writes, or any future paper passer or angel writes their number. And then the angel acts on the basis of that. Once you have that, you get the contradiction. You can equally get the contradiction in that direction. And so however you respond to that future version in order to try to get around that, because if you're a Christian, you're like, oh crap, well, the future can't be endless, because you just got the Bernadete paradox as a result of assuming that the future could be endless. Once you get that, I would argue that any response you give to that would equally be a response to the past-oriented one.
Right.
I mean, you could just go open theism, but well, firstly, that's incompatible with Trent's view. But secondly, you could suppose that God is the one who is forming these intentions, and he is the one who's going to write a particular number on the paper, if and only if he doesn't do it in the future. And even under open theism, God knows his own intentions, and God knows what he's going to do on each day of the future. Like, that's at least possible. And so I think even open theism still has the problem. Anyway, I only gave one problem. I'll just turn it over to Felipe because I'm really curious to hear his thoughts.
Yeah, real quick before Felipe talks, I just wanted to mention one other thing, because this is kind of what I found as I was investigating this thing. Is you had mentioned in your document that you thought the best objection was the, I believe it's called the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yeah. So I would definitely take that in response to him.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I found as well, a similar conclusion with regards to that. So great. Yeah. So Felipe, what are your thoughts on this? Do you think that it's possible for the past to be infinite? What's your take on that?
I'm actually agnostic about whether the past, if you can settle on a priori grounds that the past is infinite or finite.
Yeah.
But I tend to think lately my inclination is to say that it's more problematic for the theist than the naturalist to say that the past is finite. So, several people have written on this, most recently, probably Eric Wielenberg. But there's a problem with saying, like, when did God create, right? Suppose the past is necessarily finite, and these arguments, say these a priori arguments prove necessarily there was an earliest moment of time. Mm-hmm. So there's, I mean, it takes a long time to untangle this, but the basic idea is, let me just put it this way. Was God quiescent at the, ontologically prior to the moment of creation, right? He wasn't doing anything. Mm-hmm. He was just this static, timeless blur or something. Yeah. Well, if he was, then he never could have created, right? Mm-hmm. Because that would require some transition from a state of timelessness. On the other hand, if he wasn't quiescent, but he was actively creating in that timeless ontologically prior state, then the universe is eternal. And if it's preparing hell for number of moments is finite, then the universe is a four-dimensional block. Yeah. So I think it's way more problematic for the theist to take that sort of approach. They better hope, I think, the past is infinite, and God endures through an infinite number of moments of time. At least at this current point in dialectical space, it looks bad for theism to say the universe had an absolute beginning. Yeah. It's perfectly fine, of course, just by, for example, the wave function realist picture we just sketched, to say that the universe, the number of moments in the past is finite and ends in this time, originates in this timeless state, which in turn, in that timeless state entails a four-dimensional block universe. Cool. Right. Yeah. That's a totally cozy, intellectually cozy naturalist position. Just the universe is this timeless block. And so I tend to think, just a piece of advice for theists, I may regret this later, but this is how things stand at this current moment of dialectical space. Sure, yeah. You better hope that the past is infinite, because theism might be false. If it might entail the falsity of theism. Whereas, a naturalist is going to be a happy camper. Having said that, I myself am still an agnostic. Mm-hmm. So I kind of I'm just sort of watching on the sidelines as these things go out. Yeah. But I think that it's probably time to start rethinking whether we should do these arguments. One of the things, if I may say one more thing about these sort of Hilbert's hotel arguments, going back to that. Yeah. This goes back to William Lane Craig, and it seemed to be involved in Trent's presentation. But there's an objection that just has been around since at least 2002 with Wes Morriston, and then Oppie in 2006 and Draper 2008, that there's just a crucial ambiguity in the Hilbert's hotel argument. Suppose we put it this way. Premise one, if concrete actual infinites are possible, then a library with an actually infinite number of books, each labeled with a unique natural number, is possible. Premise two, if a library with an actually infinite number of books, each labeled with the unique natural numbers possible, then it would have, get ready, just as many even numbered books as odd and even numbered books combined, right?
Yep.
So just to remember that just as many, because that's where the ambiguity is. Mm-hmm. There couldn't be just as many even numbered books as odd and even numbered books combined. Therefore, concrete actual infinites are impossible. That's one way of doing the argument, right?
Right.
And the problem is there's this ambiguity on the notion of just as many that Morrison, Oppie, and Draper have pointed out
exactly.
over and over again. So this is basically a 2-decade-old criticism that's never, ever anywhere in the literature, unless it just came out, been addressed. Yeah. So on the one, it might mean that there are just as many even-numbered books and odd and even-numbered books together, in the sense that the two sets of books can be put into one-to-one correspondence with each other.
Exactly. Yeah.
True. So on that view, then while premise 2 is true, it's not clear that 3 is true, right? For an actual infinite is standardly defined as a set that can be put into one-to-one correspondence with one of its proper subsets.
Yes. Yep.
But presumably Craig's, and anyone else who gives this argument is supposed to persuade those who aren't antecedently true believers that an actual infinite is supposed to be that way, and yet remain at least agnostic as to whether actually infinite sets of things are metaphysically impossible. So it seems that nobody's going to accept that third premise unless you're already rejecting the possibility of actual infinites. But on the other hand, you might mean that there are just as many even-numbered books as odd and even-numbered books together, in the sense that neither set of books has other members besides the ones they share in common. So this is kind of the part-whole sense, instead of the one-to-one correspondence sense. Then while on that reading, while 3 is true, 2 is not. For of course, the set of odd and even numbers books has other books besides the set of books they have in common, the even-numbered books. Right. So the upshot is that the argument gets its intuitive appeal by equivocating on the notion of just as many and more, and the cognate notions of more than and less than. So, but once you disentangle those two readings, the argument loses its force.
Right, exactly.
And same thing with those subtraction arguments. So if you what's infinity minus infinity? Well, it depends. That's too coarse-grained. If you subtract the evens, then there's an infinite number of odds left over, right? But if you subtract all the numbers after 3, then you subtract infinity minus infinity is 3.
Right.
But the reason why you get these different answers is because you're using coarse-grained metrics. So you have to have a finer-grained metric to say, well, which sets?
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like saying what's finite minus finite. Oh,
yes, yeah. Exactly. Very like way of putting it.
Yes,
so
I like
it's
that.
just sort of it to me. I don't want to say it because it's a public venue. I'll just say a little bit more work needs to be done. Like, I need you to explain to me better why this is supposed to be a problem.
Right.
Yeah.
Joe, I actually really like, that's a very good way of putting it. Yeah, finite. What's finite minus finite? Well, yeah. What are we talking about here? Yeah. That's excellent. Very nice. Ben, did you want to say anything else about the causal finitism before we move on to your bread and butter, which is the moral argument?
Well, so I would just say that I would lean towards kind of the infinite model of the universe. So I kind of think of these cosmological questions in the broader terms of why is there something rather than nothing? And I think kind of the obvious answer to this is, well, that there's always been something. And so I think that if we're not going to take this infinite past view, then we have to admit that it's some point something popped into existence. So even if we're naturalists, then we just think that the natural world just popped into existence. But even if we're theists, well, God popped it into existence, creation ex nihilo. Felipe Leon has a really great analogy that I just love. It's this idea of God creating out of nothing is sort of like supposing that with a sufficiently strong dry heave, I can throw up a lunch that I've skipped. Like it just doesn't like this. So yeah, this idea of an infinite past might seem counterintuitive, but what really seems counterintuitive is this creation ex nihilo, or this idea of something just popping into existence. That's the intuition that I feel that intuition much more than I do anything about the idea of an infinite series of past events. But I think I would also say, at the end of the day, if really pressed, I'm agnostic on this. I'm very skeptical of ruling out a past infinite series of events a priori. I just think that project's kind of doomed.
Sure. Yeah, that is a great analogy. That's hilarious. I like that. Good. So let's go to the moral argument then, because Ben, this is where this is like what you work on a lot is moral philosophy. And I think when I was watching Trent's review, he kind of mentioned wanting to bring up a moral argument because he was trying to force the idea that, or at least communicate the idea that there are certain aspects of morality that naturalism does not seem to be able to account for. And the first one we have here is the idea of intrinsic value or human equality. So you were able to address a little bit of this by being able to present your view, but is there anything more you want to elaborate on in terms of your view, or maybe just the general naturalistic perspective and how it might be able to accommodate these concepts?
Yeah, so the strategy that Trent put out there was that there are these features of morality, these basic features of morality that are somehow evidence for his form of theism instead of naturalism. And he developed that in some kind of surprising ways. I think his argument was that somehow my naturalism implies infanticide or something, and that, I couldn't, because of my views on abortion or something, this counted against my naturalism somehow, or it was very difficult for me to follow how so I consider the question of God's existence and the applied ethics question of abortion to just be separate. I don't think that either turns on the other. And so I didn't want to go too deep into abortion because it just felt like a red herring. That I was just, I'll focus on the question of God's existence. And so what I wanted to say is that these basic moral features, like the intrinsic value of persons, moral wrongness itself, or something like special duties that we would have to other agents that we wouldn't have to things like moral patience, that these are all basic moral truths. So the idea is that they're true in all possible worlds. They're necessary truths. Follows from the supervenience thesis, the idea that we can't have some change in moral properties without having change in non-moral properties. So moral properties necessarily supervene non-moral properties. So the idea is, in every possible world in which the Holocaust obtains, every world that has those same non-moral properties also has the moral property of being something morally atrocious. And so these basic moral truths are necessary truths. With their necessary truths, they're true in every possible world. Neither hypothesis predicts them or the other. The probability of observing them is one. So it's not, these aren't actually datums that can decide between our theories. So that was my, to me, I think that line of reasoning is just a rebutting defeater that just takes the moral argument just off the table. And I characterized my moral view just to have it on the table, because I think that's a very powerful thing in debates, to really just, again, to let our worldviews clash and to say, no, I'm defending a robust objectivist view of morality, and I'm going to put pressure on his privation view of evil.
Yeah, and we'll get to that here in a little bit. I think his attempt in bringing up abortion was, because he even mentioned that he wasn't trying to trap you, but that I think he was trying to get you to bite a bullet that maybe would be, something that you would resist wanting to bite, that your view sort of in some way necessitates taking on these very unpalatable moral positions that theism doesn't have to, obviously doesn't have to accept. Do you think that he's correct in that a naturalist is forced into these like unsavory positions, like possibly, maybe I do have to accept that infanticide is okay? What do you think about that?
So absolutely not. So again, I don't think that question of abortion is, one that is going to help us much answer the question of does God exist or not. So I think that you could be a naturalist and be pro-life. I think that you could be a naturalist and be pro-choice. Mm-hmm. And so that I have views in applied ethics about the question of abortion, but I don't think my view implies, this idea of infanticide where it would just be morally okay to electively, kill newborn children. Mm-hmm. That's just, I don't think that's a bullet that my view has to bite in that. But then again, that's another discussion. Sure. And so I really wanted to keep everything focused on, does God exist?
Yeah.
Because I don't want anything in my case to have to turn on defending a controversial view like, the moral permissibility at certain stages of fetal development.
Sure. Yeah. Joe, I noticed you sort of nodding in agreement on. Did you want to add anything in regards to Trent's moral argument?
Yeah. So, I like, of course, just for the audience, I like to distinguish between moral ontological arguments and moral epistemic arguments. So moral ontological argument is asking about the ground or basis or explanation of moral reality, moral mm-hmm. facts and whatnot. Whereas a moral epistemic argument is just focused on our epistemic access to those. So I'm much more sympathetic with moral epistemic arguments, and I'm not at all sympathetic with moral ontological arguments. Mm-hmm. I go into this a lot more in my video, but what I would say is, I guess I could direct the audience to a nice paper by, I believe it's Chris Heathwood in the Journal of Ethics and Social Philosophy. And that is published in 2012, I think. It's called Could Morality Have a Source? And it's a really nice paper because I think Heathwood pretty forcefully shows that any view is going to have some kind of primitive or brute connections at the foundation. So primitive in the sense that it's just a primitive fact that you have some one thing or multiple things that ground certain moral truths. And since that is itself a moral truth, you're just going to have some kind of primitive moral truth. He goes through, even under say, a kind of divine nature theory, right? What grounds the fact that God's nature is good? Or what grounds the fact that God's nature is such as to generate these moral obligations or these moral truths instead of other ones? Ultimately, you reach primitives and brutes on any view that you take whatsoever. And so what I say is just cut out, I don't know. In my metaethical system, I don't have God as a grounding at all. I think it's much more mundane facts. The grounding of the impermissibility of breaking promises. I know we can get into prima facie duties and so on, but in general, it's the very nature of promise making, or the ground of my duty to intervene in a child who's drowning right next to me, and I can save the child at little to no cost. What grounds that? Well, firstly, a fact about the victim and the facts about their suffering and so on, their intrinsic states. Secondly, facts about my powers. And thirdly, facts about the state of affairs, the situation that we're in. I think that's all you need to ground it. You don't need some kind of wholly extrinsic thing completely separate from the situation that either commanded something about it or has a nature which somehow specifies stuff about it. To me, that seems utterly irrelevant. What seems relevant is the intrinsic facts of the situation and the intrinsic facts of the victim, my powers, and so on. That's what seems to me to generate the moral obligation and to ground the various moral truths. And so to me, that just seems to be, and of course, it's primitive. If you ask what's the very nature, what is it about the nature of promise making that generates that? I can ask the same thing about Trent's view. What is it about the nature of God that makes it such that promise making is good and the other ones are bad? So any view is going to have to reach a primitive. And I find the view that I just sketched much more satisfying and simpler and much more intuitive. And you have an explanation, right? You have an explanation of morality, the grounding of morality.
Just as a curious question, would you consider yourself a moral realist?
Yes, I am unapologetically and unabashedly a moral realist. Yes.
Excellent. Very nice. Felipe, what are your thoughts on the moral issues here?
I think so. I would recommend a couple things to read for the audience in case they haven't read it. There's a really good piece in the Rutledge Handbook of Metaethics by Tristan McPherson and David Plunkett. They edited it. Mm-hmm. There's some really good papers. One's called Non-Naturalistic Realism and Metaethics by David Enoch. And another one is called Naturalistic Realism and Metaethics by Peter Railton. And then if they check out the one on metaethical,
those are both excellent.
Yeah, great papers, right? And then the papers on constitutivism and constructivism in that same book by Michael Smith and Melissa Berry in particular, give a really good overview of sort of the strengths and weaknesses of sort of naturalistic moral realism. I should put realism in scare quotes, because although most of those views are staunchly realist, constructivist and constitutivist accounts are sometimes sort of, it's hard to characterize them as just straightforwardly a realist, but it's as realism as you need.
Sure.
But I think those are, in my view, perfectly plausible, intellectually satisfying metaethical theories of morality. Sort of, Mark Schroeder has a book. He's at USC. He has a book hot off the press called Reasons First, which gives sort of a hot topic in metaethics right now is metanormativity. Like, we're interested in moral right and wrong and good and bad, but what about right and wrong, good and bad in general, in terms of, epistemic norms as well as moral norms, for example, and practical norms? Is there some fundamental notion of normativity that's underlying all these different kinds of normativity? And he gives this sort of metanormative approach, which is kind of, I think it falls in these sort of what's called reasons first buck passing approaches to normativity. So the idea is that moral normativity reduces to the normativity of reasons, which is the kind of view that Ben defended.
Right. Similar to Parfit, right?
Tim Scanlon, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Tim Scanlon, Thomas Nagel, Derek Parfit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That whole tradition. And so, on this sort of buck passing accounts, like Humean accounts say that, someone has a reason to say, I don't know, tell the truth or tell a lie, if and only if phi satisfies one of their desires, right? And since desire satisfaction is a natural property, the normative reduces to the natural on that kind of a view. Well, what do you have most reason to do in terms of satisfying your desires, right? And so you can just give an account of morality just reduces to practical reasons in that way. And then there's sort of value first buck passing accounts from people like Philip Foot and Micah Lott and others who reduce moral normativity to goodness and analyze goodness in terms of flourishing or proper function or health or something. And since flourishing or proper function or health is a natural property, again, normativity reduces to the naturals. So you could have that kind of naturalism. I know Scanlon doesn't like to call himself a moral naturalist.
Oh no.
Yeah, but there are just very much people in that camp that sort of skirt the line.
Yeah.
But for a constructivist view, I'd recommend people read people like Christine Korsgaard.
Sharon Street. I absolutely love Sharon Street.
Sharon Street is awesome. Yeah, like a Humean constructivism is totally plausible too. And the bottom line is, even if people don't like, sort of a Platonic moral realism, or these buck passing accounts or constructivist accounts, people need to know that, people that are relativists in metaethics aren't anything goes relativists. They tend to think that they're, just as a matter of fact, at least the way we're built, there's just certain things that most people aren't going to be willing to do. And so certain kinds of things about arbitrary killing and stuff like that, it's not going to be part of anybody's core interests. So even if you're, those are ruled out on practical grounds, like just a matter of fact, it would be sort of, to put it bluntly, a stupid thing to want as a norm, because then why would you want somebody to kill you, right? And so sometimes this rarely comes out in these sorts of debates, as there are relativists out there, people like Gil Harmon and so forth, but they're not anything goes relativists. They're more sophisticated than that.
Sure.
But anyway, yeah, I'm in print, wondering aloud and giving reasons and summarizing reasons that other people have written on about theistic accounts of metaethics, anywhere from Robert Adams to people like I'm blanking out on his name. Mark, he is or
Mark
was at
Murphy?
Georgetown. What's that?
Mark Murphy?
Yeah, Mark Murphy.
Yeah.
So from anywhere to a Mark Murphy style theistic realism to a Robert Adams style modified divine command theorist. I don't understand. I just think they're unmotivated. They have serious problems like, if God didn't exist, then kind, honest, loving, just humans wouldn't be good, which is implausible. Or, and it's weird that if
there wouldn't be anything of intrinsic value, everything would have extrinsic value to God.
Yeah,
so it's just
that's
like
sort of the core worry. Exactly, Ben. So that's I share your core worry as well.
Yeah, that kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier,
really
like the
comes out in
extrinsic facts. Sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, but this hardly ever comes out in these debates. Is according to these typically on theistic accounts of metaethics, everything's objectively right or wrong. That is right or objectively wrong, but nothing is intrinsically right or wrong. It depends on God existing and what he happens to prefer or command or whatever. But that seems to be it seems like rape, for example, is just wrong in itself, right, independently of what God prefers or commands or decrees or whatever.
Right. Well, I want to make sure, because this was two big points that Trent brought up, and I want to make sure we give an answer to him. So you guys have given some great resources to look into. But Ben, I just want to start with you, because he specifically wants to know, how do you account for intrinsic value in, say, human equality? And I know we've said a lot here, but I just want to make sure he gets a straightforward answer. I'm sure he's going to watch this.
Sure. Sure.
Yeah.
So what I would want to say is that there are intrinsic features to persons that give us all reasons to care about them. And so I highlighted two of them in the debate. So the first one is the feature that makes us at least moral patience, the idea that we all have the conscious capacity to suffer. So the idea that we can be in intense pain and can harm one another. These are morally relevant features about us that make us intrinsically valuable. People should care about the pain that we and other non-human animals can experience. And so another feature that I referred to that I think is morally relevant in that it gives us an intrinsic value is that we are rational animals. We are the kind of animal that can respond to reasons and appreciate reasons in the world. We can recognize things like things we owe to each other, things like obligations. We can, be held responsible for our acts. We can appreciate reasons why certain people are blameworthy for certain acts, while others are praiseworthy. So just this ability of having this rationality makes us moral agents. And so that's another feature of our intrinsic value. So it's when you have these morally relevant features in something that you have something with intrinsic value. It's something that everyone has reason to care about and respect. And these are all the concepts you need for things like dignity and integrity and intrinsic value.
And I imagine that would include the human equality aspect.
Yes. And so, I'd take a line from Henry Sidgwick and, more recently Peter Singer in this idea that from the point of view of the universe, or as Tommy Snakel would say, the view from nowhere, everyone's intrinsic value counts the same. No one from this impartial point of view, the point of view of the universe, everyone has the same intrinsic value.
Excellent. Yeah. Joe, would you have anything to add to that? Do you have the same kind of view, or is your view a little bit different? How would you explain intrinsic value and human equality?
Yeah, so I mean, my view is a little bit different, and it's very, very tentative. Just because I work in philosophy, religion, and metaphysics, so I don't really work in ethics. But I do have some tentative views here, and I'll just very briefly sketch it.
Sure.
So roughly, I think I take a kind of sort of neo-Aristotelian approach to things, where at the moment I'm a realist about universals and whatnot. So I would say we all have certain properties in common, namely humanity, and so we could construe that as a universal that explains the presence of other universals or what have you, or whatever. But I think we all have something called human nature. So I think that there are natures or essences, like water is essentially H2O, and gold is essentially atomic number, what is it, 79 or something? So I think that things are essentially different ways, and things are accidentally other ways. I don't like C's to exist when I stand up or something like that. I just gain an accidental feature or something like that. So I think that there are natures or essences, and so I think that all humans share humanity in common, the nature or essence of humanity. And I think that universal, if we want to construe it that way, there are different ways to construe it. I mean, you can actually cache this in nominalist-friendly terms as well, but that gives us certain causal powers by nature. And so importantly, this view of causal powers says that there are certain manifestation conditions for causal powers, right? So like whenever you have a causal power for something, it's not as though that could that power could manifest without any irrespective of conditions, right? So if you have a match, right, the match has a power to produce heat, but it's not unless you strike it against something that's going to happen. It's not just going to spontaneously combust or something like that. So you need manifestation conditions. And so what I would say is that all humans, by dint of their human nature, have various capacities, like the capacity to reason, to suffer, to love, to give themselves in acts of love, and so on. And people at various stages of their development still have these powers. It's just that the manifestation conditions either are frustrated by lack of development or other sorts of things. And so I give and so even under my view, an infant, for instance, would still be possessed of these powers. It's just, it's at an earlier stage of its development. And so it doesn't have the manifestation conditions for the relevant powers, they're frustrating the manifestation. So that's a long story, a long way to put it, that I think that it's a kind of intrinsic grounding of the intrinsic value of us. I mean, I don't ground it in, I don't even know how it would work if you had God. I mean, that's an extrinsic grounding of intrinsic worth. Like what? I don't even understand that, but
sure.
setting that aside, but yeah, I would just have a universal shared in common by everyone. That universal explains the presence of causal powers. And it is those causal powers that I think self-evidently give us certain intrinsic value. I mean, surely things that can love, that can suffer, that can act freely, that are rational and so on. We could just see that obviously that's going to be an intrinsically valuable being. And this delivers for us the equal value of everyone, irrespective of race, gender, age, and so on, and level of development. So anyway, that's kind of my view here.
Excellent. Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And then Felipe, in terms of your views, would you have even a slightly different view from Ben and Joe, or do you mostly agree with what they've said, or what are your thoughts as far as how a naturalist might, and you in particular, might explain intrinsic value and human equality?
I've been teaching ethics for over a decade, and my views have changed so much. I've just not settled. The closest to settling now is somewhere between between either some sort of reasons first buck passing, or or value first, or metaethical constructivism. In terms of normative ethics, a bunch of different views could fit there, but in terms of metaethics, in terms of the ground of normativity, I'm sort of somewhere in between constructivist or Kantian constructivist, maybe, I don't know, maybe Humean, or reasons first or value first buck passer. Those are sort of like the least implausible views that I've seen that make a good bit of sense.
Yeah.
Man, I don't know, something similar to probably starting with, Peter Railton's paper, Moral Realism, which is in broad outlines, I think basically right. So something like that. So I guess that's closer to Ben's account. But again, I don't have anything settled there, but I find those views the most satisfying so far.
Okay, great. Ben, did you want to say anything? I think we've kind of addressed moral wrongness and obligations to persons and all this. So do you want to talk a little bit about, because you had mentioned challenging Trent's view of evil, so the privation view of evil. So I think we've probably said enough about the other aspects there. So do you want to talk a little bit about the privation view of evil?
Yeah, so one of my strategies in the debate was to press my argument from imperfection and to obviously raise something like the gap problem to try to undermine both of his cosmological arguments. So if I, poke this hole in the cosmological arguments and hit real hard with this argument from imperfection, he's got to try to overcome this gap problem. Well, how does he try to do that? Well, he tries to do that with the privation theory of evil. And so I've always seen this as kind of like a tack on, like, classical theists have this like, really robust metaphysics and ontology, and, they've really worked it out in certain ways. But it seems like ethics is kind of just an afterthought, where it's just, oh, well, things like evil are just, ways, things that are lacking. And that if we were just able to add something to the world, these things would be good. Because, anything that has substance, form, and being is itself good because God wills it. And so God doesn't will evil. So that kind of seems to be the payoff here as a way out of something like an argument from evil. And so I raised at least 4 objections to this view. So the first was that it doesn't actually solve the problem of evil, because you still have to explain why God allows privation evils. So you still have a problem of missing good. I also appealed to Hume's is-ought distinction, this idea that, the way the world is in a different category of truth than claims like the way the world ought to be. So to use Wilfred Sellers here, terms here, ought facts are going to be part of the logical space of reasons, whereas, is facts are going to be about the realm of law or the causal world. And so the third objection I raised was called the triviality objection. And so if I had one regret about the debate, I had to yield 20 seconds of my 4-minute second rebuttal, just because I had said what I wanted to say, but I didn't feel like I had said enough about the triviality objection. I wish I had to use that 20 seconds or as much of it as I could to, expound on this objection more, because the idea that I wanted to say with this is that morality just becomes trivial in this. Anything that has substance, form, or goodness, anything that God wills just becomes good by definition. So when we would say that something is good, all we're saying about it is that it has substance, form, and being. And so no one disagrees that this thing exists. We want to know whether or not it's good. We want to know if this thing can help us make better decisions, and it couldn't. It would just state a trivial fact, and so morality would be trivial. And then finally, I think is probably the most important objection is that it just isn't a plausible view of evil. Like if we're looking for an account of evil, this just isn't it. Because when we look at positive things in the world, like pain and depression, these are positive things that, like, the nature of what it's like to be burnt or whipped, makes me want to not be in those future states. What it's like to be depressed doesn't necessarily tell me that something's wrong in the world. I could be living, things could be going right for me in the world, and there could just be a chemical imbalance in me that causes depression. And so, there's nothing that we can add to the nature of pain or what it's like to be depressed and make it good. It has positive existence in the world. It's positively evil. It's not something that just, when you try to understand the evilness of pain and depression, you just can't, it becomes morally indistinguishable from the blank unconsciousness of an oyster. It's just, the only thing bad about future pain is we're not in it right now. because insofar as if we were in it right now, God would be willing it for us. It would be, it would have substance, form, and being, and it would be for our good. And any future pain we're in is going to be willed for us by God. It will be good. And so I gave an agony argument saying, look, we all have reason to want to avoid future pain. And the privation view of evil just says, no, we don't have any such reason. And so I think that's just a reason to think that view is false. And so this was, again, a strategic move on my part. I wanted to put a lot of pressure on this view because I just think it's a super plausible view. And it's his only out that he's given in the debate for overcoming this gap problem, other than the moral arguments that I think he gave, which I think I also refuted.
Joe, would you say, is this privation view of evil, is that sort of the standard position for a classical theist?
So traditionally, yes. So it traces back to, well, certainly back to Augustine, but probably before him as well. And, Augustine, he came to this because he was reflecting on what's called a metaphysical problem of evil. So essentially, Augustine thinks that, well, God, as the ground of being, is the source of everything that exists apart from himself. But surely God cannot, create something evil. I mean, that would be really weird. So if God is the source of everything apart from himself, and God being perfect can't create evil, well, then evil must not really exist. But, we look around us and we clearly see evil. And so what he develops is this privation account of evil to try to solve this metaphysical problem of evil. And it's taken up by a bunch of different thinkers in the tradition, Aquinas and so on. So, so traditionally, yes, this is certainly pretty dominant within the classical theistic tradition. You have the convertibility of being and goodness. So the doctrine of the convertibility of transcendentals, being, unity, goodness, and so on, beauty. So yeah, it's definitely kind of prominent in the tradition. I guess I have a number of different reservations, and actually there's just this really good presentation by Alexander Pruss, and it was just happened this July, I think, and he was outlining the traditional privation theory. He gave a number of quite serious objections to it, and then he developed a sort of similar view to the privation theory, where he talks about misarrangements and other sorts of things, but it's still different, distinct from the traditional view. And so I find his objections quite plausible. One of them is pain. It's just really difficult to see, and of course, privation theorists aren't ignorant of this, but pain, there seems to be a positive phenomenological character to that, and that in and of itself seems bad. So pain is certainly one. Another one is believing falsehoods. So, surely it's not good to have a false belief, at least when it comes to significant, important things. Right. But it becomes really difficult to now analyze how that is. Well, maybe you're missing a correspondence with the world, but then it's well, what about beliefs about negative existentials? It's does it have to correspond to some absence of giraffes or something? But there are no absences, or so you get into this really weird stuff. And you have to get into token relations, and they have to posit token relations. And then once you do that, you either have to say that we have power to bring things about in the past, or it gets insane. But I do think there are serious problems for that. So I'll just, yeah.
No, that's great. Would you add anything else? So you mentioned pain, which is what Ben brought up as well. You mentioned a new one as far as believing false things. Do you mostly agree with Ben's strategy there, or would you have done anything a little bit differently, or what are your thoughts there?
Let's see, how would have I proposed that? That's a great question. I probably would have raised these two problems. I would have studied up on Pruss and what he wrote there, and get into the literature a little bit, and try to develop that. So I'd raise those two problems, but then I'm just not sure how much it helps his case. Especially with respect to the gap problem, his as in Trent's, especially with respect to the gap problem. I mean, sure, if God's purely actual, then there's no privation within him that in some sense he ought to have, but he doesn't in fact have. We can grant that, but that's not sufficient for moral goodness. This is a kind of metaphysical goodness, as thinkers within the tradition recognize, right? So let's see, a plant, right? A plant. There's not going to be any moral goodness there, but there are still going to be certain privations like withered leaves and not enough sunlight and so on. So there's a kind of metaphysical badness there and a privation of metaphysical goodness, even though there's no moral goodness and so on. So all Trent would be able to get is that this thing is good in the sense that the various ends built into its nature are fully realized and so on. But like, that would allow you to say that a perfectly round circle, not the ones that we draw on paper and so on, but a perfectly round circle would be fully good because it doesn't have any privations that it's failing to realize. And so, I mean, is that fully good? I mean, I guess you could call a perfectly round circle good, but like, this is not the kind of gap. This is not the gap problem that we want to be solving. We want to get to omnibenevolence. We want to get to moral goodness. And this argument just doesn't get you there. So I don't think it even helps with a gap problem. So I ultimately, I agree with Ben's strategy here.
Excellent. And Felipe, what are your thoughts on the privation view of evil? So you mentioned you've taught ethics for like 10 years, I believe you said. Have you ever addressed this view of evil? Does that kind of idea come up in your classes, or what are your general thoughts on that?
It comes up mainly in philosophy of religion courses, but my views just basically echo what's already been said, that there seems to be clear paradigm cases of positive evils that can't be reduced to a privation account, right? At least without some swallowing some hard pills. So I think those are theoretical costs for that sort of account, and that I think that sort of theodicy would do well to accommodate it with other strands of theodicy. I just don't see it as plausible or having wide explanatory scope to explain all the various panoply of kinds of evils.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Well, that's very good. Let's then go on to the argument from simplicity. And Ben, you made a case for why you think naturalism has a higher intrinsic probability than theism because it's simpler. And maybe let's unpack that a little bit, because there's some back and forth between theists and naturalists on which is actually simpler, and in what sense, what do we even mean by simpler, and what makes something simple or not. So maybe you just want to give us a sense of your idea there.
Yeah, so I wanted to include this argument because my main argument was going to be the argument from imperfection. And that in one of the ways that I was going to cash that out was using a Bayesian inference. Now, if I'm going to use a Bayesian inference, I have to say something about a prior probability somewhere. Now, even if I wasn't making this Bayesian inference, I still think it's an important argument. And so I think it can be a bit misleading by saying, I probably shouldn't call it the argument from simplicity. What I'm trying to argue here is that theism has a low prior probability. And so why am I saying that? I want to say this because I think that what's built into most theistic hypotheses are many immodest claims, and that these many immodest claims don't coherently fit well together. And so I took this line from Paul Draper. And so the idea here is that there must be some sort of way to objectively evaluate prior probabilities. So he uses the example of a race. He says, two people start the race at the same time and they run exactly as fast, but someone wins the race. Well, that can only be the case if one of them started out ahead. And so he uses that to illustrate this idea that, look, if two hypotheses have the exact same explanatory power, but one of them explains the day, but, we should prefer one hypothesis to the other, then it must be because one of them is simpler than the other. And so I wanted to cash that out in terms of modesty and coherence and give a dilemma for the classical theist by saying that, look, if you back off if you back off from claims of like Christian theism and just go to bare theism, the more modest you are, the more problems of coherency you have. And that if you try to solve these problems of coherence, the only way you can do that is at the price of immodesty. And so that either way, the prior probability of theism is low.
Would you say that classical theism in particular has a pretty low probability as compared to just general theism? So
I would argue so, yes, because I feel like it comes with just more claims. It comes for more tensions to come arise in it. I tried to outline some of those tensions with various forms of modal collapse by pointing out that the doctrine of analogy, this idea that we can't really say what we want to say about God in any, the pieces just don't coherently fit well together. I think that all of these commitments that the classical theist has a priori just count against the prior probability of the hypothesis.
Now, in line with that, Trent made the claim that, he kind of concedes, maybe naturalism is more modest, but theism seems to actually be more coherent. How would you like to respond to that?
So I just deny that. So I would just say, theism, especially classical theism in particular, is notorious for having problems of coherency.
Sure.
Theism wants to say that God is infinite and unbounded, but is also separate from his creation. There's all kinds of just problems of coherency that naturalism just doesn't face.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's also trivially obvious that, monism is simpler than dualism. Like, if I'm working with an ontological monism and theism implies an ontological dualism,
sure,
that's just, already you're winning the modesty race
mm-hmm.
there. He also objected that, theism had a prior probability of 1, which I thought was kind of a fun. I was like, okay, well, that's confusing metaphysical, the probability of an epistemic probability, it's not good. You're not going to be able to avoid my argument by just saying, well, God, if he does exist, exists in all possible worlds.
Right. Exactly.
So I don't think that works. And I also think he tried to challenge the simplicity of naturalism by saying that the definition was circular, which I thought was kind of strange, since I gave a conception of naturalism,
mm-hmm.
the idea that causal reality is causally closed. Right. That didn't use the term naturalism, and then he put Draper's definition of the mental explaining the physical, or the physical explaining the mental, a non-circular definition. He put that on the table, and so for me, I was like, I realize that naturalism is a difficult concept to characterize, and people characterize it differently, but I didn't see any problem with the concept I put on the table, and I didn't see any problem with the concept he put on the table. So it was hard to see what the objection was there to my argument from simplicity.
Yeah. In a moment, Felipe, I want to ask you about actually that definition, because actually from what you've written in your book with Josh Rasmussen. But before we get to that, Joe, you were kind of nodding your head there. What are your thoughts on this? The idea of bringing probability into this. Some people complain that, it's very difficult to try to come up with probabilities or prior probabilities for these things. Do you think that's a worthwhile path to go down, or can we get anywhere with that?
Yes and no. Yes, insofar as, this is a problem, and, the problem of the priors and so on, that's being explored. But no, in the sense that this is a problem for like all Bayesian reasoning in every field. There's nothing distinctive to philosophy of religion here. If it's a problem for like all Bayesian reasoning, and you certainly don't want to throw that out altogether. So that's one thing that I'll say. So I don't really think it's a distinctive problem in this dialectical context. We can kind of set it aside. And usually what matters is that you have what matters usually is the likelihood ratios. I mean, if you're giving an argument from evil, say, and naturalism trumps theism by many orders of magnitude on the likelihood ratio, predicting the data, Well, then at a certain point, when you amass data, the priors kind of just go out. You would have to be like absurdly certain that a given view is false, given certain evidence. But anyway, so I think we can kind of bracket off considerations of priors, but not always, because Ben, pointed out that if you can show that the likelihood it might be roughly similar, weighing up all the evidence, well, then you can focus on the priors, and that's where the Draper kind of argument comes in. So I think that there are certain objective constraints. So clearly, if there's no strict contradiction contained within a hypothesis or strict entailed by it, well, then arguably you shouldn't assign it a probability of 0 if there's no such contradiction. I think, moreover, that we can focus on how many claims something says, how many claims it makes about the world, and it's just a fact that the more claims you make, in principle, epistemically speaking, the more ways you have of being wrong, and so the less probable you are. We can also talk about symmetries. Paul Draper talks about the symmetry between the mental precedes the physical and explains the physical. That's on the one hand. And on the other hand, the physical precedes the mental and explains the mental. There's a kind of symmetry there, such that I think we could just see that a priori, it would be utterly ad hoc and arbitrary to just make one more intrinsically probable than the other. There's a perfect symmetry there, it seems. And so once we get that, well, then we can compare views that are only proper subsets of those. And if one is a small subset of the whole family of views, well, then we know that it's going to be less intrinsically probable compared to one that, say, occupies a greater space of the views on the other side. Now, I know I've kind of touched on prior and intrinsic probability. There's a crucial and important distinction there. And so I wanted to highlight that, but we don't really need to pursue that in depth. Prior probability is just prior to looking at a given piece of evidence. Intrinsic probability, you're looking at the hypothesis itself, you're looking at its modesty, its coherence. There is a distinction there for the audience. So don't think I'm running roughshod over that.
Yeah, no, and would you say that you agree that classical theism sort of suffers in those regards, and modesty and in those ways?
Well, certainly compared to perfect being theism, because it adds those 4 core theses, which makes more claims about the world. And so that's going to lower its probability. And moreover, it opens up opportunities for more tensions to arise. That's not even saying that tensions will in fact arise or do in fact arise. Remember, for the audience, we're thinking of epistemic probabilities here. And so all that matters is that you're making more claims about the world, and hence, in principle, epistemically speaking, you have more ways of being wrong prior to looking at the world itself. And so that's a matter of your modesty of your hypothesis. And of course, coherence ties in with that, because you can have certain tensions arising. But anyway, certainly compared with perfect being theism, it's less intrinsically probable.
And would you agree that, do you think naturalism really does have quite a bit of an edge here in terms of its intrinsic probability?
I would say it depends on the definition of naturalism. I've seen many different definitions. Yeah. Good. So honestly, I can't answer that. Sorry.
Okay. No, that's perfect, because that brings us to what Ben had mentioned, is in terms of Trent's sort of pushback against the definition of a naturalism. And real quick, this before I forget, because Felipe, in your book with Josh, you kind of mentioned so that there was the idea of whether the mental precedes the physical or vice versa. But what I got from your book was sort of that a naturalist could even go the other way, as say, maybe there is some, I think you called it proto-mental, if I remember correctly in your book. So some kind of proto-mental properties.
Yeah, so proto-phenomenal properties or proto-representational properties. Yeah, sort of like a pan-protopsychism.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Your line of thinking that you mentioned was exactly what I was thinking as you guys were talking. It's sort of like this chicken egg problem of what came first, the mental or the physical. Right. And it's sort of, well, both came first because there is the hypothesis that they're both together, right? That again, my Spinozistic leanings tend to say, well, why don't you just say that there's one stuff and it has both physical and proto-mental or proto-phenomenal states. It's
neutral monism for the win.
Yeah, that's right. Big props. So yeah, I think that's another hypothesis you need to consider as well. I think does Draper mention that anywhere? I'm thinking of the SCP entry. I can't think of it.
Okay, well, from my familiarity with his work, what he does is when he's talking about supernaturalism versus naturalism and theism versus naturalism, he basically just starts off with saying, listen, he recognizes that he's doing an assumption, but or he's making an assumption, but he's just going to assume that there is a physical world, there's a mental world, these things are distinct, and we have to ask about the relationship between them and where the explanatory relation goes. So he does kind of make an assumption there. And in his later work, he explores, like, I think he has panpsychotheism, like he explores that in a paper and other sorts of things. But I distinctly recall reading one of his papers or articles where he's like, listen, seems like just an ordinary starting point, common sense. There's the physical realm, there's the mental realm. These things are distinct. Now let's ask about their explanatory relation. So he kind of does that.
That's right. Thanks for jogging my memory. There's that paper. He has it's like a chapter in like current controversies in philosophy of religion. Or
I think
like
I think that's what I'm remembering.
Panpsychotheism. That's a great paper. Definitely eye-catching title, and as usual, a fun paper. His fun personality shines through it. But yeah, that would be my kind of proposal. And I tend to think. I tend to agree with Draper and with Ben to think that naturalism is going to, depending on your characterization of naturalism, say for example, this sort of Spinozistic panpartopsychist view, sort of priority cosmopsychism, I think, as Yuji Nagasawa calls it. I think it's going to win this sort of race. One thing, of course, that I would mention is I think that theism isn't going to win out in coherence because I think it's incoherent. I think that because it has built within it the doctrine of creation ex nihilo, I think that's prima facie impossible. It's going to be problematic. I guess I just don't see. Again, when I was watching the debate, it occurred to me that perhaps Trent had. I know that in fairness to Trent, he questioned. He was asking Ben, well, what do you mean by naturalism? But perhaps in the back of his mind, he thought something. Trent had something in mind with something like materialism or something like that, and of course, that's no necessary commitment to being a naturalist. Although there are plenty of people in that camp. Spinoza himself seemed to take himself as a naturalism by saying God or nature as two different sides of the same coin. But anyway, I would question the coherence there, and I would throw in, of course, the hypothesis of some sort of naturalistic view that has both some quasi-mental and material attributes as part of its essence, as one of the competing naturalistic hypotheses in this race.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but was Chalmers sort of the first one to come up with that idea? Because I believe he has that kind of view, right? Where like posits that there's just this other set of properties that belong to the physical world.
You can probably find it in the pre-Socratics.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah. He's not the first, but he's definitely the most popular defender.
Okay,
property dualism.
Fair enough.
Yeah, you might even say, perhaps even Heraclitus and Thales were something like this. But I think you're right. I think sometimes he calls it Russellian monism, hunting to wrestle in his works like the analysis of matter, the analysis of mind way back. Yeah. And before that, there's Spinoza.
Yeah.
Anomalous monism, and there's different versions. Like, well, maybe it's neither physical nor mental, but the physical and mental arise from it. So there's variations on this, but it's been around for ages. Yeah, in some form or another. But you're right. Chalmers is sort of like the canonical late 20th century text, the conscious mind, to bring it back to the fore again.
Right. So correct me if I'm wrong here. It seems to me that Ben's definition, working definition in the debate was maybe the better way to go, given that we want naturalism here to fit within a subset of non-theism, right? Because that's the whole idea, is being opposed to theism here. And it seems to me that the Draper view, a naturalist could accept mind first in some sense, like we've been talking about. Does that sound right? That maybe Ben's view was the more appropriate one? This could go for anyone.
I didn't.
Go ahead.
At least for my own part, I think I kind of missed part of the question.
Oh, so I was just, since Trent was pushing back on Ben's definition and brought up the Draper idea of, he explains it as the mental preceding the physical or vice versa, that naturalism is the physical preceding the mental. It seems to me that maybe that wouldn't be the most appropriate definition for a debate like this, given that a naturalist could, as we were talking about, take something like a maybe mental first, or what you were talking about, proto-mental position. So it seems to me that Ben's definition of just talking about the causal closure might have been the more helpful definition in this debate. Does that sound right? Or
yeah, I think so. It's so hard again to characterize. I actually don't think anyone succeeded in characterizing naturalism. Yeah. I like to just look at specific proposals.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot gets too much time gets spent on what naturalism is, and just say, hey, here's a view, and let me flesh it out, and then let's see which data it explains, and let's modify it whenever there's a piece of data that seems like we have to shoehorn it into our.
And so that's what I tried to definitely emphasize in my most important argument, the argument from imperfection, because I was saying that naturalism implied the hypothesis of indifference. So that hypothesis was doing a lot of work for me. So we could actually shelve the concept of naturalism and focus with just the hypothesis of indifference if we wanted to. And so what I really wanted to do with the argument from imperfection is to, kind of tie the rational knot that is the problem of evil. And tie also the argument from divine hiddenness into it as one of those imperfections, to give 4 unique ways of cashing out the premise that there are imperfections in the world such that the world is, on the whole imperfect in a way that's just incompatible with a perfect being.
Ben, your definition seems to me to be much closer to Graham Oppy's definition that he gives in.
Sure.
Yeah, I think it's Naturalism and Religion, I think, is where he sets out.
That sounds right.
Yeah.
I'd have to, someone in the comments will correct us if we're wrong.
Yeah. Excellent. So how are we doing on time? Felipe, are you good? I know, Joe, you said you have to head out in a little bit, and we are super grateful for the amount of time you've given us so far. Felipe, how are you doing? Do you have a certain amount of time you have?
Actually, I'm running over a little bit. I have to tuck in the Rugrats, but the Munchkins, but
good. Yeah.
That's fair enough. We could probably go, because the only thing left, I've mentioned the argument for perfection. Joe's written a ton. So there was my argument from freedom. Yeah. And so it's kind of a modified modal collapse, though I don't wed myself to modal collapse. I tried to add God's intentions into it. The idea that God being perfectly free entails that he intentionally could do otherwise. And how that was a problem of coherence. You've published some recent work on modal collapse. Joe, do you want to say something real quick before we close it out?
Yeah, so I have 2 papers. One of them is a kind of knowledge-based modal collapse argument. That one is called the Aloneness Argument against Classical Theism. That's just the title of the paper. And that one's co-authored with Dr. Ryan Moles. And then the second paper, and this was a really fun one to write. I really enjoyed this one. I enjoyed it so much because I was slightly polemical in it but it's called The Fruitful Death of Modal Collapse Arguments. So I look at different modal collapse arguments based on the identity of God and God's acts, as well as God's being purely actual. And I argue that classical theists can avoid modal collapse with respect to those arguments. I'm not talking about knowledge-based modal collapse arguments. I myself have defended one. But with respect to those kinds of modal collapse arguments, classical theists can avoid them if and only if they accept an indeterministic causal link between God and creation. And then I kind of just explore that and look at potential problems that might arise from that. I just wanted to advance the debate, but so people can check that out. But yeah, that's the main thing that I'll say.
No, that's great. Felipe, then again, we really appreciate your time. Is there anything any last things you'd like to comment on as far as the debate?
Close us out, Felipe.
Yeah, close us out here.
I think Ben should have the last word. He did such a great debate. I really appreciated your work, Ben, and also bringing sort of contemporary, sort of cutting edge arguments into the discussion, and your methodological approach of, hey, I need something that's sort of empirically informed and isn't purely a priori. Not that armchair philosophy is necessarily bad or anything. There's lots of good in it, but surely there's a lot to be said with empirically informed philosophy of religion as well, and so I appreciated that in your discussion. But I still want to think more about this. I don't have time to do it right now, sadly, but I want to think more about this argument from freedom. Is there any way I could get? Do you have like a paper that you?
Yes. So there's a paper that I'm kind of working on and putting together, and I'll certainly send it to you.
In between us, yeah, I found the exchange between you and Trent. I think you had the upper hand in that. I don't think that, especially as a Thomist, aren't Thomists sort of compatibilists about freedom and determinism?
It varies.
Yeah, and so it's one of the things I wanted to try to pin him down on, but it would just, we can't respond to everything. It's just too much.
Yeah.
But Felipe, I'll also send you my paper because I actually addressed that argument in my paper. So
sweet. Yeah, send it along. I would love to read it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, super excited. Yeah, this modal collapse stuff in general, I'm super excited about. I don't have a paper on it or anything, but I don't know. I'm inclined to say modal collapse is awesome because if you think that, I guess I should clarify modal collapse with respect to, for example, let's just stick with theism and modal collapse. All possible worlds going to reduce to one possible world. Bummer. I'm like, no. If God
modal simplicity.
Yeah. I tend to think maybe there is only one possible world, or given the good Everettian that I am, that necessarily all possible worlds exist. So the modal collapse turns out God would necessarily will all possible worlds if he wills one of them, because you can't, by the nature of physical reality, you can't create one world all by itself. You have to create all of them. It's just one branch of the wave function.
Yeah.
And so there's one world in a sense, but in another sense, every world is actual and necessarily actual, or something like that.
I'm happy to meet another fellow Everettian.
All right.
Yes.
up in the spot.
Yep.
Anyway, on that goofy note, I better let you guys go. I can hear the kids, so I better put them down.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you so much for your time and joining us, both of you. This has been a fantastic experience, so really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, likewise.
It's an honor to have y'all on. I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, I hope we can do it again.
Likewise, it's an honor to be on. So
yeah,
thanks so much, and I hope to talk to you guys soon.
All right, have a good night.
You too.
I'm gonna head out as well, guys. Thank you so much for this, and see ya.
Yeah, thank you again for agreeing to do this and coming. I really can't wait till we do it again. Sorry it's taken so long to have you on the show. I don't know why. I don't really have an excuse.
No. It's all good, dude. I've even got a response to Trent coming out tomorrow. So.
Oh, nice.
Very exciting. So also.
I'm going to try to do a response video of my own. There was a lot of pushback on the idea of a perfect world, so I'm going to try to do a whole video to unpack that as well.
Oh, nice. I'll send you the video once it comes out, and I'll be sure to send both you and Felipe my paper. So,
awesome.
Peace.
Thanks, buddy.
Bye.
See ya.
All right, guys. Y'all be safe.
If you enjoyed this interview and more broadly enjoy content of this kind, please subscribe to our channel to see more interviews and other interesting philosophical content. Do philosophy with us by sharing your thoughts in the comments below. We'd also love to get your feedback and any suggestions for future videos. Be sure to like our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter. And if you'd like to help us continue to provide quality atheological content, please consider becoming a patron of Real Atheology and contributing even just $1 per video. Sharing our content on social media is also a great way to help us out. The Real Atheology team appreciates its current patrons, with a special thanks to Robin Willems, Ed Atkinson, Kim Pachkovsky, Jason, Kashi Samarawira, and Brandon McCleary. Again, thanks for joining us, and until next time.